This is a talk about organic weed management, and this is the first part to a two-part series where we'll be talking about principles and concepts. First thing about weed impacts in agroecosystems that everybody needs to understand is that there's two general areas where weeds can impact crops. That is the first one is a qualitative reduction, where weeds can interfere with operations, maintenance operations, planting operations, harvest operations. Weeds can also taint the product, like staining so for example, black nightshade or grading when a product comes in and the buyers finds a bunch of weeds that can downgrade the pricing for that particular crop. There's also quantitative reduction. Wherever weed is where a crop plant could have been. So we call this is the concept of competition, and competition leads to yield loss. But then there's also another area called Alleopathy, and this is where a plant can produce a chemical that will inhibit the growth or development of another plant. And this is not competition, but these are the two general areas where weeds can impact agroecosystems. And the way I like to look at weeds is essentially is captured very well with this cartoon, this Dilbert cartoon called Cube Farming. And I'll let you read it for a second. But essentially what's happening here is that Dilbert is this nice productive worker, we'll call him the crop, and the boss of course is right off his shoulder and interfering with his productivity. And so of course when the boss is removed, Dilbert feels more nourished and refreshed. This is if we do nothing about weeds, we can show example after example of what weeds can do to a crop if you do nothing for the weeds. Anybody who's ever farmed will understand this concept. Anybody who's tried to get away without weed control completely understands this concept. Essentially, you can suffer 100% yield loss if you don't do anything. And we can show example after example of how this happens. So integrated weed management is the approach we take, especially here in California, but pretty much all over the US and most modern world that does the same thing. Anyway, integrated weed management has several different steps to it. And the first step is assessment, identifying what the weed is and then monitoring for those weeds and having frequent recordings, frequent visits to a field to see what's going on, especially when it comes to weeds, especially with the weeds. Then you start getting into more of the control measures. One of the first control measures is prevention. And prevention can really be summed up by just keeping things clean, clean seed, clean equipment, just preventing weeds from coming into a field in the first place. Believe it or not, can have a huge impact for weed control. The next step with integrated pest management, integrated weed management, in this case, is cultural. And these are essentially just good farming practices. And I've summed it up here with soil preparation, just getting the field ready and creating a situation that's going to be optimal for the crop. These are cultural methods. We'll talk more about these during the control part of the next presentation. Also, the next category are physical, or also known as mechanical methods. These are big tillage operations. These are very, very important for organic weed management. There's also biological control. We'll talk more about that in the next segment. And then there's chemical control. And these are there are some organic herbicides. We'll talk about that during the control segment of this talk. First, identification. What weeds are you dealing with? This is very important from the standpoint of how to control the weed, knowing what it is, what its weaknesses are, what its strengths are, and before you take the first step to controlling it. And the first level of identification really boils down to whether it's a broadleaf or a grass. In this case, a monocot is a grass. You see that on the left. A perfect example is barnyard grass. And then a dicot or broadleaves. This is black nightshade on the right, another perfect example. And we'll go through some of the steps to identify exactly what grass you're dealing with and what broadleaf you're dealing with. But this is the first level of identification that becomes important when it comes time to do weed. For broadleaf species, dicots, the key identifying characteristics are at the very beginning. It's important to capture weeds at the very beginning in the seedling stage because what you're hoping to do, what you should do, is prevent seed production. And in order to do that, you need to capture it very, very early on because weeds are capable of producing seeds at a very early stage of their life, unlike crop plants. So the key identifying characteristics that you're going to want to know when it comes time to identify a weed is to know what the cotyledon looks like, and to also know what the first true leaf looks like, second true leaf, because these can be very different than the cotyledon, and then second true leaf can also be different than the first true leaf. So what's important during identification is to collect a bunch of specimens and to have a bunch of them, keep them fresh, put them in a Ziploc bag with a cool, wet paper towel inside. So you bring it back to where you can sit down and go through the process of identifying this your particular. Grasses, some of the key characteristics are usually have to do with the collar region. The collar region is right where the leaf separates from the stem, right here. And what you're looking for is the presence and absence of certain characteristics. One of the important ones is a characteristic, this thing called an auricle. And auricles are these finger-like projections that wrap around the stem, and they're extensions off the leaf that can wrap around the stem. What you're looking for is what the form of that auricle is. Is it hairy? Is it long? Is it short? Is it present? Those are important characteristics. Another part of the collar region that's important is the presence or absence of hairs, how long those hairs are. And do they extend up the stem? Do they, and again, presence or absence. The third characteristic that's important is the ligule. And the ligule is basically, I call it a Dracula's collar that goes up back behind the sheath of the leaf. And usually when you pull the leaf off the stem, you will see very clearly whether this ligule is present. What you're looking for with the ligule, and you will be asked questions about this during the identification phase, is it membranous? Is it serrated? Is it hairy? Is it even present? These are characteristics that are important. If grasses are probably the most difficult stage, grass seedlings are the most difficult stage to identify for any weed scientist, and you will find this to be truly difficult when it comes time. If it comes to the point where you need to use a flower to identify a particular grass, just realize you will be coming back next year and dealing with this plant, because once it produces seed, you're coming back next year. So the University of California Integrated Pest Management Program, this is the link down below here. This has a great tool for identifying what weeds you have. Use this tool, use this link right here. You can see where the starting points are. UCIPM has done a great job of putting up pictures, putting up very simple to understand descriptions of what characteristics you should be looking for. It's very, if you're not trained in classical plant taxonomy, the terms that are used in taxonomic keys can be very difficult and very intimidating. But the University of California Integrated Pest Management Program's website has done a great job of making it very easy to understand and quickly identifying what weeds you might be having. This is the broadleaf weed gallery. Next here, this is the grass identification weed gallery, and it shows you some of the common weeds that occur in our cropping systems here in California. This is a weed identification tool that's available through the University of Wisconsin site. The link is also available in the Weed Research and Information Center, which is also part of the University of California IPM program. This particular tool, you'll see the link down below here, and when you get to this tool, this website, first thing that you want to do, of course, is for search location, you want to pick California. This was developed in Wisconsin initially by Mark Rands and Joe DiTomaso, and Mark is now at Wisconsin, but this tool is also works well for California. The next step is to pick whether you have a broadleaf or a grass, and I give you easy tools earlier in the earlier slides to be able to pick which one you have, and then of course you'll go to step two. Step two is essentially where you're going to get asked quite a few questions about characteristics of where you found the weed, general characteristics of the weed, some of the leaf characteristics, stem characteristics, and then it keeps going on. So what's important to understand with identification tools such as this one is that when you pick one of these selections, is to have the freedom of mind to be able to change it later in case you get to the very end and you don't see your weed. You may have to come back and change some of these selections. This is one of the most important lessons you can learn when it comes to plant taxonomy. Also, it's not essential that you answer every single one of these questions. It's whatever you have in front of you. So for example, if you have just a seedling, you have to rely on all the characteristics that would be relevant to a seedling. But again, what's important is that if it comes time for you to go back because you don't see your weed in the final selection, it's important to make note of which one of these you were not certain about. And again, have the weed in front of you and from your Ziploc bag with a wet paper towel that you kept in the fridge. Keep it fresh so that you can answer each of these questions while looking at a real specimen. The common broadleaf weeds in California are these: pigweeds, purslane, malva, bindweed, lamb's quarters, spurge, nightshade, oxtongue. And these are just a couple examples. Yellow star thistle is a rangeland natural ecosystem weed. But the weeds that you see above here, these are very common at California agriculture, and essentially anybody who's farmed in California knows these weeds and usually knows them well. I've got bristly oxtongue on the side over here, and then this is yellow star thistle that's down below right here. For common grasses in California, again, I've showed you a picture of the collar region, the characteristics that are important to identify. With auricles and ligules. But the common grasses in California are these: the bromes, wild barley, wild oats. These three are very common annual exotic grasses that occur in our foothills. They're all over California, especially up in the hills, especially up in rangeland. You will find these sometimes in winter cropping systems, not too often in summer systems. Ryegrass is another common winter grass. Annual bluegrass, another common winter grass, and then barnyard grass, Bermuda grass, kikuyu grass, foxtail. These are all common. These last four are common summer. Another concept in agriculture that's important to understand before while doing weed control are weed crop associations. And so weed crop associations form when one particular weed management method is used in a cropping system. And it's very easy to fall into this trap where you have a certain management tool that you use and you use it over and over again. What happens is you're using the tool because it kills a majority of the weeds. Problem is that there are the few weeds that are going to escape. Usually it's certain species that will escape. Often it's species that are very closely related to your crops. And the reason is because your management method, if it's going to kill the weed, it might kill the crop if they're closely related. So we end up with these associations, weed crop associations. So it's relatively easy to know what weeds a certain person has if you know what crops they grow. So for example, in rice, it's barnyard grass. That's a very common weed crop association. Arrowhead is another common weed crop association in rice. So is red stem. So is small flower umbrella sedge. And tomatoes, black nightshade is a common weed crop association. Why? Because they're closely related. Black nightshade and tomato are in the same family. They're solanaceous. In organic systems, it's nearly impossible to tell the difference between a black nightshade plant and a tomato plant. When you're hand weeding, it's very tough. And so you end up, of course, with nightshade and tomatoes. Very easy to pass this up. In cole crops, it's mustards. Why? They're closely related. They're in the Brassicaceae family. So what controls mustards will also kill crops, and so farmers tend to avoid those methods. And you end up with those weeds in those particular cropping systems. Malva and cotton is another example. Next area and concepts that's important is to understand what life cycle you're dealing with. So with weeds, it's whether they're annuals or perennials. Those are the two most important categories. There's a third, biennials, but we'll talk about annuals and perennials first. First, the annual system starts with the seed, and so the seed will usually be in the ground, and that seed will germinate. And when it germinates, it has to get through dormancy. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And once it germinates and becomes a seedling, and it puts on a couple of leaves, and then it becomes fully established. Once it becomes established, it's considered a vegetative plant. Then it starts to flower, and of course, when it flowers, it produces seed. That seed falls back into the soil, and it closes the loop. The strength on the annuals is the seed. Once seed gets produced and once seed gets into soil, it is very difficult to control these species, these weeds. Weed seeds are nearly impossible to kill once they get buried into soil, and with dormancy and longevity, that these seeds can last a long time, and dormancy keeps them from germinating. Even if you do the right things to get them to germinate, that will ensure that these will stay forever. The problem with annuals also is that they will start to form seeds very, very early on. So it looks like it's a long period from seedling to flowering plant. But you'll see weeds that have 2-4 leaves on them that will have a little flower in their leaf axils. And that flower, of course, is leading to producing seed. And that's only at the 2-leaf, 4-leaf stage. They'll start flowering very early on. With perennials, the strength of a perennial is in the vegetative plant, and in particular, it's the modified stem. Modified stems are very difficult to control once they get formed. What's wicked about perennials is that they will also produce seeds, and those seeds have all the characteristics that annuals have. The seeds are usually not the most important structure on a perennial because they're not they're often not viable if the perennial is in very good conditions, very good water, good light, they will produce viable seeds when they get stressed. But meanwhile, if they're in good conditions, it's this vegetative modified stem that will basically ensure that that perennial stays in your field for a long period of time. So annuals live less than a year by definition. Biennials live between 1 and 2 years, and perennials live more than 2 years. These are some very common summer annuals that you'll see in California, and also other parts of the country. But redroot pigweed, common purslane, and barnyard grass. These summer annuals, what they'll do is they will germinate usually in the late winter time, and then they'll start to flower in the summertime, which is why they're called summer annuals. They will live less than a year, and but you will, even though we say that they start flowering in the summertime, these summer annuals can start flowering very early, even in the spring. Like I said, after 2-4 leaves, some of these plants will start to produce flowers. Winter annuals, these are just a few common winter annuals. Sow thistle, annual bluegrass, and mustard. These species tend to germinate in some of the first couple rains in October, November, and then they'll start to flower in the winter time, and then they will be in the seed stage during the hostile summertime for these species. Meanwhile, the summer annuals, they're in the seed stage during the hostile periods for them, which is in the winter. Some weed species in California are difficult to categorize as far as winter and summer annuals. Malva is one of the examples here. I have Malva neglecta right here. There's also Malva parviflora, but there's horseweed. There's a couple others that are difficult to tell if they're winter or summer annuals. You'll actually see mustards growing in California. You'll see their yellow flowers extending well into the summertime. So, but by definition, we say that in general they germinate and flower at those particular times I just mentioned. So the strength of an annual species is its seed, and I'm showing you redroot pigweed here. It's very, very common weed in California, and the seed is the very small black dot right there. And so the strategy that most annuals in California take with their seeds is they produce many, 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 many super small seeds. They do not invest very much in each seed, but they produce many seeds that essentially, once they get into the soil, it's really a lottery. They're basically playing that strategy. They have many, many, many progeny, hoping that one of them is successful. And very often, not just one is successful. Many are successful. So these seeds, once they get into soil, they have characteristics that will prevent them from being killed. One of them is dormancy and longevity. These two characteristics will guarantee that a weed scientist will always have a job. Dormancy is essentially the physiological characteristic that either comes from the embryo, the seed coat, or sometimes the environment. Essentially, it will prevent weed seed from germinating, and it's very difficult to predict. very difficult to control. Sometimes you can scratch the seed coat with plowing. Sometimes you can expose it to a flash of light. Sometimes photo periods, sometimes temperature fluctuations. There are things that you can try to use to crack dormancy, but there will always be some percentage of the weed seed bank that won't germinate, and that dormancy is a very, very difficult characteristic. Longevity is the ability for weed seeds to live a long time if they don't germinate. The most common fate for weed seeds is usually death by germination and then dying from something, lack of water or weed control or something, or by beetles, ground beetles, or by carabid beetles, or mice or birds are also very effective at eating weed seeds. That's another way they can be killed. But what's important to understand with these two characteristics, dormancy and longevity, is they contribute to a strong seed bank. A seed bank are a bunch of weed seeds in the soil. That's the most common weed seed bank, and they represent a memory and momentum. So a memory of past management practices, right? Because those are the weed seeds that essentially those are the plants you didn't kill, right? And so the ones you did kill, right, those weed seeds don't make it into the weed seed bank. So the memory is they remember what management technique you used before, and the momentum is that because of dormancy and longevity, they will be with you for a very long period of time. Simple perennials are those perennials that live more than 2 years. They propagate by seed, and dandelion is a very common example of these simple perennials. These are wicked in and of themselves, but they have both characteristics of modified stem and also this seed production. The creeping perennial represents probably a more dangerous perennial, though it depends on who you talk to, but essentially these perennials can produce seeds and an underground modified stem called a rhizome. And a rhizome is a horizontal underground extension of the main stem that has nodes. And you know that's a modified stem because you see this root-like structure has these leaf sheath-like structures that go across the organ. And that tells you that it's a modified stem. And right where those nodes are many, many buds. And those buds, when they germinate, they can produce stems above ground and they can produce roots below ground. The white portion of that modified stem is loaded with carbohydrates that will support that growth. These are very difficult to control once they get underground. And if you chop these, when these things get chopped up, each one of those segments can become a brand new plant. And those carbohydrates will ensure that they'll be there for a long period of time. Another modified stem is the swollen end of a rhizome. What you're seeing here, this is the rhizome on the far left-hand side that looks like a root. Again, it is a modified stem. You can tell because of the leaf-like structure that's attached to it. And right where it's attached is the node. At that node are a bunch of buds. At the end of this rhizome, you'll find a swollen end called a tuber. And the tuber is also a modified stem. And it's got a leaf-like structure that surrounds it too. And where it attaches to the tuber is where the node is. And where the node is are where buds are. And that white substance underneath there, those are all carbohydrates that will support bud growth. Both buds that can produce stems above and roots below. This happens to be from a nutsedge plant. This is showing you a nutsedge right here. Another creeping perennial structure is called a stolon. A stolon is an above ground modified stem, and Bermuda grass is a classic example of one of those. Bermuda grass is really wicked because it has stolons, which are above ground modified stems, but it also has modified below ground stems like I said, rhizomes. And they're also capable of producing seeds. These are one of the most difficult perennials to control in California, along with field bindweed. Very, very difficult. So moving on, we in this concept segment, weeds grow where crop plants are not competitive. And so when I walk out into a field, what I look across that field and I see a patch of weeds, that patch of weeds tells me there's something wrong with that ground. There's something not optimal for the crop on that piece of ground. And so you might think, wow, weeds like to grow where soil or where soil conditions are bad. And you often do see that. You'll see any place that's not optimal for a crop is where weeds will be. And so this can be bad soil, it could be salt, it could be a myriad of things. It could be too dry, it could be too wet, it could be a low spot in a field, a high spot in a field where water settles or water doesn't make it. And that's where weeds tend to do better. It could be where fertilizers are too high or too low for the crop. It could be where the seed bed wasn't prepared properly. It could be hard pan. It could be dirt clods. It could be just cultivation mistakes. It could also simply be planting gaps, right? These are some very simple problems, but what they represent are opportunities for weeds, and that's what weeds do. Weeds are basically waiting for, well, which every one of us has to do. We have to sleep sometime, and that's what weeds are waiting for. So you might think, when I show you this graph, you might think that weeds like bad conditions. So what I'm showing you here is growth, simple growth over different resource gradients. So low resource levels versus high resource levels. And I don't care what those resources are. Let's just pick water. So low water where it's dry, and then high water where it's flooded. You typically see a weed response that looks something like this, right? And so you might think, well, okay, well, that's pretty broad response from a low dry conditions to super wet anaerobic conditions. But this doesn't mean anything until I show you what the crops typically look like. Crops response will typically look like this. They have a narrower response, but often they have a higher response if you give them the right conditions. If you give crops optimal conditions for their growth, then often the crop can actually outcompete the weeds. And so what we can conclude here is that weeds don't like bad conditions. They just tend to do better in bad conditions than the crop plant does. And so what our jobs are is to guarantee that we provide optimal conditions for the crop so the crop can do its job and do half of our job of competing against the weeds. Now, why can weeds do this? Why are weeds capable of handling these bad conditions? It turns out they have this characteristic called plasticity. And what this is, it's simply adjustability. They can adjust. And one of the easiest things we can measure to look at plasticity is root to shoot ratio. And the root to shoot ratio is how big the roots are relative to the shoots. And what we'll often find is we'll find that the root to shoot ratio will be high when water or nutrients, underground resources are low and light is high. And you might think, well, wait a second. And then it's vice versa. When it's the other way around, when resources underground are high, the roots are small and the shoots are high when the light is low. And you might think, well, wait, how is that possible? Why is it like that? It should be the other way around. Well, wait. What weeds are doing here is they're allocating their new growth to the organ, whether roots or shoots, that are acquiring the most growth limiting resource in that particular situation. So if you look back again, so they have big roots when water and nutrients are low, so that those big roots can acquire those really limiting resources. They're moving all over underground trying to find those limiting resources. Meanwhile, the shoots are in really nice conditions and high light, so they don't need to be big, which is why you have a high root to shoot ratio. And if you follow economics, this is exactly the strategy that most successful businesses play. What they'll do is they'll make sure that the resources they need for maximal production at the end of the day, every single resource is equally limiting to production, so that at the end of the day, no resource is more limiting than any other resources. They're all equally limiting. And that's exactly what weeds are doing right here. It's beautiful. The problem is that we bred this ability out of crop plants because we found that their plasticity took away from harvestable yield. And so crop plants aren't capable of doing this. And so they maintain a relatively constant root to shoot ratio. Problem with this, of course, is that they're not very competitive, especially when conditions aren't perfect, which is why weeds do so well in those bad conditions, low resource or high resource gradients. Competition for space. Competition for space is really a competition for resources. And when we talk about resource competition, whether it's water, light, nutrients, whatever it is, you might think, well, what we want to have a plant that is capable of outdoing. We want a crop plant that outdoes a weed for resources. But what it has to do with, what often it has to do with how fast the plants grow. This can be a density dependent factor. What that means is how many plants there are in a given area. What's your planting density? How many crop seeds did you put per acre out in your field? The more seeds you have, the faster that crop will capture those resources. That will be a good thing. Well, it can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing. But resource capture really is very important when it comes time to doing competition, when it comes time to compete against weeds. Really, the bottom line is getting to the resource first explains most plant competition more than any other thing. So it's getting there first. It is a foot race, not a wrestling match. So if two plants got to the same resource at the same time, you might think, well, one's going to out wrestle the other one. The one who wins had that plant most often got there a little bit before the other plant got there. And so it grabbed that resource and it's not available for the other plant. That explains. Let's take a closer look at this density thing. Density is basically where how many plants you have planted for a given area. And so we often find this is the only law, one of the only laws we have in plant ecology. So bear with me. It's called the law of constant yield. And so what we're looking at is the biomass for a given area, right? So if you have a very few plants for a given area, those few plants, they're not competing against each other. And there's plenty of room for them to grow, but there's a lot of bare ground at the end of the year, at the end of the day. And so the biomass for a given area is actually pretty low when you have very few plants planted in that given area. As you add more and more plants to that area, those plants will begin to compete with each other. They'll start to run into each other. The leaves will start to overlap. Their roots will start to overlap. And when they do, they will start competing. And you'll get to a point where any piece of ground can only produce a certain amount of plant biomass, right? Competition begins where this curve starts to flatten out like this, right? Now there's a really wicked additional concept that really hurts agriculture here called constant yield that relates to marketable yield. We also call this harvestable yield. What happens is the curve tends to go up just like it does with low planting densities. And it starts to plateau at a certain density, and then it starts to drop. What's happening here is that the crop plants are running into each other, and they're competing with each other to the point where harvestable yield starts to go down. So for example, corn plants, if they get to be too small, they won't produce an ear of corn. And so you end up having in a given area too many corn plants, you won't get any corn off that field because all the plants are too small. Each plant is too small. Same thing with lettuce. Lettuce has to be a certain size before it's marketable. If it gets to be too small because of competition, it's not marketable. So that yield goes down. So this is why we need to plant at the optimal planting density. And every single cropping system has an optimal planting density that's been established for it. Weeds push everything to the right. And so if weeds are present, and this is very common in organic systems, you will find that it's going to impede it's going to impede your marketable yield, which brings even more urgency for getting rid of those weeds to essentially maximize your yield. The concept of critical period brings together the density aspect, but also the getting there first aspect. So in the very beginning, if you plant a crop in a field that's had weeds before, your weeds will germinate. The weeds will be there. You planted your crop, so you know your crop's going to be there. When they come up in the very beginning of the season, there will be plenty of space for both weeds and crops to grow. As they grow, as each plant starts growing, it will get to a point where the plants will start to run into each other. When the crop leaves start to overlap the weed leaves, you know competition is beginning. What happens above ground is about what's happening underground, roughly. And so when that competition starts happening, you know that you're going to start eating into marketable yield. When that happens, if you remove the weeds at that point and keep the field weed-free for the rest of the season, that crop plant will establish, it will grow, it'll get to a point where it captures all the above-ground resources, all the below-ground resources it needs to maximize yield. And when it does, you could theoretically allow new weeds to come up because those new weeds will be so small and their roots and their shoots will be in a different position where they can't capture resources that the crop plant already has captured, that the crop plant will reach maximal yield. This is called the critical period for weed control. And what's important about this concept is that you don't need to do weed control for the entire season. And you can see right in the middle here is where you don't need to do any weed control. with this simple concept. Now, I need to warn everybody here that when weed seeds are in the picture, if weed seeds get produced by any of these plants, the ones that made it to the removal period and the ones that germinated and got to harvest period, if they produce weed seeds, they will represent issues that you need to deal with later on. So this could interfere with the critical period for weed control. The critical period for weed control, the easy way is this: begin weed control when weeds and crops just start to interfere with each other. Stop weed control when crops are completely covered, all bare soil, because they've captured all the resources they're going to need to meet maximal yield. But when seeds are introduced to the equation, it can be problematic, right? So this is something you're going to want to keep on mind. Some crops are just not very competitive, like onions, and so the critical period for weed control could extend the entire season, where you shouldn't let any weeds grow. And then again, like I said, if weed seeds come up, then this critical period for weed control might be moot. Competition for water. California water, we're blessed in one way, we're cursed in one way, blessed in another. And the cursed part, of course, that we have a lack of water. We get very little water during the summertime. The blessed part about it is that we have control over the water that we do have. And that control can be in the form of furrow irrigation, but nowadays we have precision agriculture that is afforded with drip irrigation and drip tape. We have control over the spigot, so we can basically say when water gets turned on, when water gets turned off. So putting water when and where crops will get to it first will ensure that getting there first. Remember competition? Getting there first will ensure that the crop wins that part of the competition. Planting into moisture, we'll talk about that in the next segment with control measures. Using bare drip tape or drip emitters for precision can add to your ability to get water when and where the crops will get to it first. And scheduling irrigation precisely for the crop evapotranspiration rates. Knowing what the water status is of your crop and ensuring that your crop stays competitive and not watering anymore. Using water as a form of crop insurance is a risky thing, because essentially that water can go to the weeds, and you can actually hold back on water in certain situations. It depends on the physiology of the crop and the physiology of the weed. What I mean by that is there are certain plants, for example, you'll see here the C4 species are these particular weed species and crop species. I randomly selected weed and crop species. These are plants that have a C4 physiology that are much more efficient for water and producing biomass than the C3 species. C3 species are much more common. And you can see here that the water use efficiency that I'm measuring here, the season-long water use efficiency, is how many grams of biomass are produced per kilogram of water. And you'll see the C4 species are much more efficient than the C4 species are much more efficient than the C3 species. And it's roughly a 31% improvement for C4 species. Now, what this means from a practical standpoint is if you're growing corn as a crop, and you've got smooth brome as a weed, then you can actually hold back a little bit on water, and you will be shifting competition toward the corn. Of course, if it's vice versa, if you've got rice as your crop, which is C3, and you've got say red root pigweed as your weed, then holding back on water is not a wise thing, because you need extra water in that situation. Anyhow, food for thought. Alleopathy is one of the last concepts that I want to cover. And alleopathy is very, very attractive to organic farmers. And it's attractive because these compounds are compounds that are produced by plants. So they're organic by definition. Well, they're very attractive that way, botanicals, that essentially interfere with the growth and development of neighboring plants. And this has very recently attracted lots of attention. And but I want to leave you with a word of caution on how attractive these compounds are. This, by the way, is not a form of competition. This is really a form of interference, because producing an allelochemical to suppress your neighbor is basically, it comes as a great cost to you. And because that allelochemical represents fixed carbon that could have been used for growing yourself. And so producing these toxins to interfere with others can be quite costly to the thing that's doing it. I want to just use one example of allelopathy that really highlights why you need to be very cautious about allelopathy as a form of weed control. Back in 2003, there was a very exciting paper published by Bayes called that was looking at spotted knapweed, the chemicals called catechin. That essentially the thought was that these compounds explained why spotted knapweed was so successful in rangeland. Turns out, so when the study was repeated in real soil conditions, like agricultural conditions, not petri dishes or pots, the catechin didn't do anything. So real soils, what this tells you is that real soils are very complicated. The true success of spotted knapweed probably didn't have anything to do with catechin. It probably had something to do with its superior mycorrhizal relationships with the native fungi that exist in these native soils in rangeland in the Midwest, which is another exciting, like, how did that happen? This is very, very complicated stuff, and what it really reveals and what the conclusion should be is be very cautious about this allelopathy story. As a plant ecologist, what I say is that allelopathy, allelochemicals are there's no way they are ecosystem drivers in plant-plant competition. They might be the straw that broke the camel's back, but they are by far not the hay bale that drove why competition happened the way it did. So just be cautious. Conclusions for this segment. Integrated weed management and integrated pest management is the approach we took. You saw the listing of the steps, and we will I'll get to the rest of the steps in the next segment. But what we're trying to do is minimize impacts, economic, social, environmental impacts with this strategy. Identification was one of the first steps. Broadleaves and grasses are the first step that in separation for plant ID that you need to know. Relatively easy, but can be complicated with certain species. Plantain would be a good example. Anyhow, identification is the first step because knowing what weed you have, you better understand its strengths and weaknesses, so you can better approach when we talk about control how to kill those species. Annuals, summer and winter annuals are a category of life cycle, and seeds are the strength of annuals. The perennials are species that grow for longer than 2 years. The modified stem is their strength, but they are also capable of producing seed, especially when they're stressed. Weed plasticity, dormancy, and longevity contribute to a weed seed bank that represents a memory and momentum of past and future weed problems. And those two characteristics, dormancy, inability to germinate, and longevity, being able to live for decades, those two characteristics will ensure that weed scientists will always have a job. Competition for space is really about getting there first. Doesn't matter what space we're talking about, light, water, nutrients. And then allelopathy. Cautionary note about allelopathy, but it only highlights some very exciting future research that needs to be done, and there may be something to this.